we might make a start because I'm wary that everyone's busy on a Friday morning. So I'll thank you all for dialing in today. My name's Jarrod Hill. I'm one of the directors at SPORTEng, and I trust you're all safe and well, and obviously dialing in because unfortunately you might have some assets that have been underwater. So thank you for your time this morning, and we're hoping you'll get something out of it that we can give you some information to assist you with your rehabilitation or readiness of your fields of play. Just like to quickly start with a welcome to country. SPORTEng acknowledges and pays respect to the past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just a couple of quick housekeeping before we jump into it. If I can ask everyone just to mute themselves if they haven't already. We'll have a chance to do some questions at the end, either through the chat or through open conversation if it works that way, depending on how many participants dial in. The format of the presentation of the webinar today will make up of a 40 to 45 minute presentation split into some key topical areas. And at the end, we really want to free up some time for some Q&A sessions, because no doubt some of the people on the line will have some direct questions that are relating to some of the issues they're facing at the moment. As I said, throughout the presentation, if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat. We will circle back to them at the end and go through them. So if there's something that comes to mind during the presentation, just put it in the chat. We may answer it later during the presentation, but if not, as I said, we will circle back to that. As I said, I guess what prompted us to put this webinar together was just identifying the needs of the communities and some of the councils, particularly in the southern sections of Queensland and the northern of New South Wales, and really touching base on the specialty area that we operate in, which is typically the design of fields of play. But the three presenters we have here today have sort of had a lot of experience in not only the design, but the maintenance and upkeep and ongoing preparedness of these fields of play. So, I guess we're broken it down in some key areas: natural turf and the synthetics and acrylics and other running track elements. And then at the end, keen to sort of talk through on some ideas on what can be done to future-proof potentially some of your assets. I said the three speakers, which I'm one of today, we've got John Neylan, who's probably one of Australia's, if not Australia's, most leading turf agronomist. John's had a lot of experience in flood mitigation fields. John's had 40 plus years in providing agronomic advice. Andrew Morrow is a civil senior engineer by trade, but for a bulk of that was responsible with the design and maintenance of fields of play, and has joined the dark side from a consultancy side in the last 12 months. And myself, I'm almost clocking up 20 years in designing and providing technical advice to all fields of play surfaces. So we've got a bit of a wide ranging there. Input from the three of us, and as I said at the end, if there's some questions we haven't touched on, please don't be afraid to ask us. I guess the problem that we're really just discussing is now not so much building the fields of play in the prone area. That's unavoidable. I think if these lands were of any good and safe, we'd probably see more buildings on them. The sports fields are built in floodplain areas because of low land value. So I guess what we're really trying to impart on the participants today is some steps to get the fields of play back to a level of use, and it's a touch base at the end of some things that if there is availability of funds or for future consideration, ways that we can you can potentially mitigate some of the future disruptions. I should say at the start also, this has been recorded, and we'll send out a form of either the recording or of a summary of it for those participants who are dialing in, and also those who cannot make it. So without further ado, Andrew, I'll pass over to you to talk through the synthetic side of things.
Thanks very much, Jarrod, and welcome to everyone. Must admit, I'm feeling for people in Queensland and New South Wales in this niche market of sports. Been there myself over the years in one or two projects that have suffered the same. What I thought I'd start with is probably the easier one to look at, and that's hard courts or effectively acrylic coatings on either concrete or asphalt. And if some of your venues or facilities have gone under floodwaters, and the main problem with floodwaters, they bring a lot of silt with them, a lot of dirty water that once it subsides, it normally leaves that silt and that onto the surface, which obviously makes them, doesn't matter what sport, but it makes it unplayable. And that's the trick really, is how do we get that material off the surface and the surface back to something playable. Predominantly, is a fairly consistent theme through the through the synthetics, whether it's hard courts, synthetics, synthetic fields, or athletics tracks. Water jetting or water pressure is predominantly one of the main uses. So hard courts, you can see the top one to the bottom one. It is literally forcing the silt and that off into one area. With tennis courts, you'll be surprised at how much material does come off. So getting rid of that material or picking up, the worst thing that we can do is actually flush it down into the drainage system. It's only going to cause you issues back down the track. So by bunding up around your drains and then physically shoveling or picking up that material is one way to go. It's effectively the cheapest and the easiest to do so, and it's done by hand on courts predominantly, and it does take a fair while. Probably one court to do it properly will take 1 day if it's in not too bad, but if it's got a good inch or so silt on, then maybe a couple of guys for a couple of days per court. But you end up with a court, as you can see down the bottom there, pretty well in the same thing. You may have some damage in terms of, you may have some splits, you may have some abrasions or markings on the court. Once again, this is fairly simple to repairs. All the acrylic systems out there have repair products out there, and they can be repainted, a couple of coats of paint over isolated areas, or if at all, if you really need it, you're going to resurface with 2 coats of colour over top and a new set of lines, and that will pretty well keep you in good stead. Moving on, so if I have a look at the next, that's acrylic. If we move into the next area, which is short pile sand-filled artificial grass. So this particularly is in tennis or in hockey field. You're looking at products that are somewhere between 13 mil and 20 mil in length, and most of them are fully sanded or at least half sanded. This is now getting more difficult to get the material, those floodwaters that come over the top and drop the silt in, but it's still the same process. Tennis courts, due to the nature of them being small and fully enclosed, is a little bit harder to get any motorised equipment on. So as you can see, water jetting is still probably the preferred method. Once again, you're going to remove a lot of material, and you will be taking some of the existing sand material that was originally installed in the product. So you'll lose a fair bit of that product. The way, or the main reason that we're really trying to get it out of the synthetic grass is that the grass backing itself has perforations in, which allows water, natural rain events, to actually pass down through it into either a system underneath and then travels horizontally out to the low point. So with the silt net coming over the top, what we're doing, we're actually clogging up the sand, because the sand that has been put into these products originally has a certain flow rate. It's a fairly coarse sand, between 1 and 0.5 mil. So it does allow the water to migrate down underneath. So if you're getting silt in there, you're getting particle sizes under 0.075 mil down to really fines, which will over time block and clog it up. So you may end up having to nearly reduce or pull out all of that sand, and then have to resand it. But with a bit of luck, if it's laid on asphalt and concrete, if that's what your surface is, the water will actually should pass over the top. If it does get in underneath, it's normally sitting on being asphalt and concrete, it'll still be a firm base. Some of the, especially in hockey, and particularly in the smaller pile grass on tennis courts, the grass is actually bonded to either a shock pad or to the actual asphalt and concrete. In that case, I would suspect that most of the courts, the actual synthetic grass, will actually still be in place. It actually won't get wrinkled or moved lifted up. So it is a matter of just cleaning the silt. But a lot of courts, especially in tennis, were laid on a crusher dust or a crush rock base. And if the floodwaters have been moving at, excuse me, at a reasonable pace, you may have come in underneath, and you will get some lifting or wrinkling, the shifting of the synthetic grass on the top. because it's only a 13 or 20 mil fibre, it is possible to kick those wrinkles back out and to move them and that. But the first thing you're probably going to have to do is actually split the seams, roll the grass back, and actually have a look at the subgrade, the crush rock base. That may need some remediation works before we actually put the grass back. It can be done. It is time consuming and obviously and labour intensive. So, but it isn't a matter of just pull whole grass up and start again. You certainly do have opportunities to reuse the grass if it's still in reasonable condition. Moving to the longer piles, probably the most difficult out of all the synthetic surfaces to rectify after floodwaters have passed over the top. Predominantly, the reason is it's a longer, if we're looking at soccer, AFL and rugby, we've got anywhere between 40 mil and up to 70 mil in terms of pile height. And we have about 20 mil of free pile, meaning just that's what you'll see is the grass, and then the infill starts underneath that. So it captures and will hold a lot of the silt as the water's passing across the top. Now, these fields have, as part of their system, will have a sand layer on the bottom as a weight, as a ballast to hold the grass in place, because they're normally just sitting on crushed rock. And then you'll have a performance layer, whether it's a rubber or a black rubber, a virgin rubber green, or maybe an organic infill on top. That is somewhere between a 1, or say 0.8 to 4 mil in granule size. So the silt will actually get down and sit down into that, and it'll probably get in between the two layers, that performance layer, and sit in amongst the sand. So you need to be able to get that out, because once again, we're relying on the systems to allow water to pass through it into an underlying drainage system, and then either move vertically or horizontally to get the water off site. These fields are normally got a 1% grade on, it's graded from one side to the other or diagonally. So it's quite a distance that the water has to flow. We're talking up to 60, 70 metres. So if it gets down through the system and it flows underneath, well, that's all well and good. But with silt through the mix, we've now got a system that is going to clog up, and these to meet the sporting codes regulations, it's somewhere above 180 millimetres an hour has to pass through the system. We'll now not have that. That'll be reduced, so it won't meet the sporting codes criteria. This is a type machine. It's a brush. There's many different ones out there. We're talking 8,000 square metres, or AFL, we're talking up to 16,000 square metres, which we now have to try and remove all this infill and the silt at the same time. And you can adjust this. You can, if you've got a 50 mil product, you've got somewhere around about 30 mil of infill, you can take out 10 mil at a time. So you can remove the infill, the rubber on the top, which is the silt. You might take another 10 mil layer off, and you might find that you've actually removed most of the silt. You can get down and have a look at it. You can do some infiltration rate tests on it. You at any of the layers to get a feel for how the remaining infill is performing. But just to let you know, just to give you some insight in terms of how much material and obviously therefore the cost, you've got around about 280 tonne plus on a soccer field. So that's a lot of material that you're taking out. One, you have to pay to get rid of it, or it is you can clean it, but it's very expensive to clean it and then reuse it. And obviously you've got to buy that material and put it back in once it comes out. So yes, it is expensive, but the grass itself shouldn't be affected by the flood. It's in terms of the fibre, and that won't fall apart. It is a matter of just trying to clean it, unless we have a worst case scenario where you really do have some floodwaters. And we have a look at the next slide. We've got you might unfortunately end up with a situation like this. And this is very hard to fix. It's very time consuming. If you can get to the seams and split the seams, each roll is somewhere between 3.6, 4 metres in the rolls, and then make it into manageable pieces. You've got the ability then to try and reuse this grass. In some cases, it might be stretched a little, but you can get it back into the right form. you will need to remove some of the sand because, or the infill, because just the sheer weight. I mean, these rolls are up to 60 metres long at 3 metres wide, and you've got somewhere around about 30 to 40 kilos per square metre. So physically, it's it's just impossible to lift. If you try and pull it with machinery, then you're most likely going to stretch the product or you're going to tear the product. So to get a pressure washer to try and remove some of the silt along the seams first so that you get access to it, and then get it effectively back into the rolls that it came in terms of width and length. But to use a mechanical machine like the tractor and the brush that we had on the previous slide, you can't do that unless it's dead flat. That's the only drawback. So in this case, it is a lot of pressure washing to remove some of the existing, well, some of the silt, if there is silt there, or at least the infill, to make it light enough to be able to manually separate the rolls and then work on effectively each roll side by side. But the product itself has not been damaged. The actual fibre and the backing is still in a condition that you can actually, if you spend the time and clean it, you can actually reuse it. So on a soccer field, we're talking upwards of $300,000+ in material. So it's worth spending the time, if it's a fairly new field, to actually try and get that pitch back in order. The smaller or tighter fibres that we see in lawn bowls probably protects itself from getting in floodwaters and letting the silt and that get down into the bottom, so onto the black backing. So it certainly is a little bit easier. The other benefit of lawn bowls is that they're all pretty well fixed around the edges, so the likelihood or chance of floodwaters getting underneath and creating a scenario like we just saw on the longer pole is probably minimised or nearly taken out of the risk, because it is fixed. So that if it predominantly, you've got two styles. You've got the woven on the bottom, or you're up on the top, you've got a texturized yarn. And you see, because of the dense nature of it, and that texturized yarn will be about half filled with sand, it'll probably keep the silt up the top. So with brushing and vacuuming and water jetting, you should be able to get most of the silt out. Once again, lawn bowls, because they're dead flat, obviously, to play on them, they require vertically draining for water to drain through the perforations and holes through the backing of the synthetic grass. So if you can't get it clean, you'll end up having puddles on the green, which is going to be unacceptable. So and that it's critical that you do get all that silt out to get it back into that condition of being able to use it properly. So look at the last slide. It comes down to probably the last of the synthetic products that we use on sports fields, and the most expensive. So polyurethane running tracks. We've got 3 types in Australia that we put down. We've got a sprayed system, which is porous. We build composite tracks, which has a impervious 3mm red layer on top, and then we have a full polyurethane, which is more of an Olympic style track that's solid polyurethane. Most of the tracks around Australia fall into the sprayed and the composite areas, and so you've got different challenges, I suppose, if you've had floodwaters and silt dropped in over the top. If we look at a spray track, it's effectively a 13mm rubber surface that is porous. The flood, normal rainwaters run through it. It hits the asphalt under a concrete surface underneath and runs horizontally through that 13mm rubber surface. So it's certainly an issue if you get silt down in there, because it's just going to clog up all the pores of the rubber and won't let the water run. Effectively, it'll be a non-porous system and the water's going to shoot across the top. But what it also does is the silt then clogs up the actual rubber texture on the top, and it becomes a slippery track. So if you weren't running with spikes and you're running with runners on a wet day, you'd find it very difficult to get grip. The water jetting is primarily the way we clean tracks, and in extreme cases of floods, it's certainly how we do it. Now you will, as you can see from the top picture with the hand spraying or the hand water evacuating, you see a lot of silt comes over to the edge. From an environmental point of view, there's normally an inside drainage system, a graded trench or a spoon drain around the inside of the track. Please don't wash that dirt down the track. All it's going to do is create problems for you later on by clogging up the drainage system. So blocking the drains up and effectively sweeping and shoveling into bins and getting rid of the silt, and you will be surprised at just how much you'll get rid of. What I've used down the bottom is using a water jet in a machine that actually has a vacuum underneath. So it effectively sprays and lifts the silt up to the surface, and the vacuum sucks that silt and the dirty water into a tank at the back. And that way you can go and take it out. You can go and put it into a bunded area, discharge the dirty water and the silt, let the water evaporate out, and then you're going to have the silt that you can actually get rid of. It's a really, in terms of getting silts off tracks, it's probably the best way. It's probably maybe a little bit more expensive, but overall, you're going to get the track back quicker. Probably takes 3 days to get a track with a ride-on machine to clean a track normally. If you've got heavy silt after a flood, yeah, you're certainly going to have an issue in terms of it might take about 7 days. The issue with polyurethanes, especially on the composite track and the Olympic style of full polyurethane, is that they're an impervious system, and we don't want water in underneath on the asphalt or concrete layer, because it's a impervious rubber blanket over the top. If you get vaporization or moisture in underneath and a hot day and it starts to vaporize, it'll actually, the only way for the vapor to go is to come up, and it'll actually delaminate the track off the asphalt itself, and you'll see little bubbles. Might be size of your hand and about 20-30 mil high, but it'll actually bubble up. So just be careful. Probably if you've got a track that's gone underwater, certainly get someone out to have a look at it to see whether they're on the edges, whether it's come away and whether water has got in underneath, and make an assessment. One good way of doing it to kind of see is, I mean, you can drill little holes, 1/8 mil hole through it, and you might see some water bleeding out through it. That's just something to be aware of if the water has got in underneath. I haven't really seen tracks with water gone in underneath actually end up like the synthetic grass on the previous slide, but it's more residual water staying in underneath. How do you get that out? You might have to drill some holes along the low edge to actually allow it to breathe and evaporate out over time, so you don't get those bubbles. So in all, that's look, water jetting's a big feature of cleaning synthetic surface on any type of sporting events. Jarrod will talk a bit more about later on maybe how we can in the future look after some of these incidents that we're seeing more often. I'll pass over to John on the naturals.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Hello to everyone. And as Jarrod said before, I hope everything's going reasonably well, just from a safety point of view. Having spoken to several colleagues in Queensland and also New South Wales over the last week or so, there's certainly some challenges ahead. I suppose the one positive with natural turf is that it's very resilient, and from my experiences going back as far as the 2011 floods, some other flooding involvements I was involved with in Southeast Asia, and also the last 2 or 3 years with some of the big turf farms in New South Wales, it is very resilient, and recovery is usually pretty good, but we need to be patient. We need a little bit of time. Anything to do with turfgrass agronomy, it's usually multifaceted, the things that will damage the turf, both in the short and long term. In the case of floods, there's the silt deposits that Andrew's spoken about. There's the depth of the water. Interestingly, we've had turf under water for several weeks, and providing that water depth is relatively shallow and there's light coming through, it's amazing that the turf can actually survive under those conditions, being underwater for such a long period of time. The time the turf is inundated, across the turfgrass species, some turfgrass species are more flood tolerant than others. Fortunately for most of New South Wales and Queensland, we're talking about couchgrass, which tends to be the most flood tolerant. Having observed grasses like zoysia grass and seashore paspalum, they are severely damaged by flooding, particularly if that period of inundation is several weeks usually. The age of the turf on very old, very high organic matter type turf profiles, they can tend to suffer more damage than a relatively new turf profile. So with floods, there are dirty floods and clean floods, and talking to some turf production guys in New South Wales a couple of weeks ago, their hope was that it would be a clean flood this year compared to a very silty, dirty flood in the previous year. The silt deposits are certainly the most damaging from a number of points of view. That silt layer can sit within the profile, particularly sand profiles. They restrict water infiltration. They have an impact on root growth, so we tend to have restricted root growth, and then that affects the resilience of the grass and its ability to recover. All flooded sand-based profiles certainly require significant renovation following flooding so that we can get rid of that silt layer. And the quicker that silt layer is removed, usually quicker the recovery. So there's a number of things. It's a living, breathing system, turf systems. So the factors that are going to affect the turf is oxygen depletion in the first instance. We get rotting of the root systems and lack of light. The depth of the water will have an impact on that. Interestingly, we probably suffer more damage from floods if we've got a flood that's only a few centimetres deep and it sits for a period of time, because that water will often heat up, and that really causes severe damage to the turf system underneath. So in some respects, you want a clean water flood that's maybe 200-300, maybe 500 centimetres deep, rather than a very shallow layer of water just sitting on the surface. So time underwater is critical. From my experience in Australia, most of our floods don't tend to impact the turf systems for more than 2 or 3 weeks. We have situations where we've seen couchgrass survive quite well, sort of greater than 6-week period, but once you get turf underwater for more than 6 weeks, that's when you're going to see the greatest amount of damage. We've then got the issue of saturated soils. So once that water's dissipated from the surface and got out through the stormwater drainage system, we can then often have a very saturated profile. So there's going to be a lack of oxygen. It's going to damage the root systems. That water within the profile, if we get hot weather, will also heat up, and that will sort of further damage the turf. Couchgrass, or the cynodon species, they're the most resilient. As I said before, most of our natural sports fields in New South Wales and Queensland would be couch, so that's a significant advantage. One of the key things is if it's a dirty flood and there's a lot of silt, the quicker that silt and mud can be removed, the quicker the recovery. So if that silt sits around for a long period of time, the grass is going to lack from light. It's not going to be able to photosynthesize. It's going to deteriorate quite rapidly. So we want to get that silt off as quickly as we possibly can. So this is a couple of pictures from 2011 floods up in Queensland. So that silt layer on the left-hand side there, it's quite significant, obviously, but big efforts were made on that particular locality to remove the silt quickly. And then within 6 weeks, the couchgrass had recovered, quite substantially, to a point where it's a reasonably good, healthy couch cover and a playable surface again. So if we have a look up here, some of the things, it's not the best of pictures, but this has got a little fine silt layer within the sand profile. Even a silt layer of just a few millimetres can be enough to seal the surface. So it becomes really important on well-built, well-drained sand profiles to remove that layer as early as possible. Otherwise, we're going to find over time during wet weather, we're going to have poor drainage characteristics. The surface is going to be waterlogged, and that's going to cause further damage to the turf. Rotting of the root systems can be a significant problem as well. In the short term, we may not see some issues, but in the longer term, we can find that we'll have more issues around sort of disease infestation, particularly if the root system's weak and the plant doesn't have the ability to sort of fight off those infections. Though, again, because cooch is very resilient, this plug here, this was taken from a cooch profile, sand profile. It had been underwater for 6 weeks, and the root system recovery within just a few weeks was really good. So again, if we've got the right grass in these situations, often the recovery can be quite quick. Though we do need to have a little bit of patience, and we don't work the grass too hard, because if our root system is compromised, as it is in that photo, the grass can actually be set back quite quickly. So the keys to successful recovery, the turf will be weakened. So it's important not to force the growth. We do often find that once the sun comes out and the surface water's disappeared, people do want to get back onto these natural turf surfaces. And sometimes there can be a little pressure to maybe work the surface a little quickly or force the growth with fertilisers. We just got to allow the turf to naturally start to recover, allow the profile to dry out. We certainly don't want to traffic saturated soils. Removing the silt's a little problematic, but sort of posi-track type equipment is probably the best way to do that, or using squeegees and water. But we don't want any sort of heavy machinery or machinery with knobbly type tyres to be running over saturated soils, else they're going to cause significant damage. Getting rid of the silt's important. Repairing the irrigation system. It's interesting, on some occasions we would find that because the root system has been compromised, we'll get a spell of warm weather, hot weather, and the turf will actually start to go into wilt. Even though there's still water within the profile, the root system is compromised to the point where it can't actually access that water. So it does actually need a little bit of irrigation. So repairing the irrigation system early is extremely important. We then, when the soils are sufficiently dry to take the equipment, we need to be hollow coring, taking plugs of soil out of the profile. Verticutting, which is sort of taking slices of vegetation off the surface, then top dressing with sand to try to break up those, or both remove and to break up those silt layers. Lifting cutting heights, just to take a little pressure off the grass as well. So while we might be at the back end of cricket season, we like our low cutting heights. Sometimes we need to compromise that a little bit, lift the cutting height. That allows the root system to recover. Weed control is usually a big issue. Floods tend to bring in a lot of weed seeds. So an ongoing weed control program is really quite critical in the overall recovery. Disease control as well, particularly later in the year. So we have the floods at this time of the year, sort of mid to late winter months, early spring. We might see some of the root rot diseases having an impact on the turf. So it may actually be necessary to make some fungicide applications as well. So as I've already sort of discussed, using posi tracks, removing that silt early is important. Hollow coring. So we've got a machine that punches holes in the ground, pulls up plugs of soil and turf. That needs to be vacuumed off and removed. Scarifying surfaces to break up silt layers, and also then followed by top dressing to get some fresh sand in there, just to improve the permeability of the surface. Weeds is just an ongoing problem, and sometimes in severely flood impacted turf, the first thing to actually come forward are weeds. So having a good weed control program in place is important. And some of these root rotting diseases will tend to come forward probably later in the year. Not immediately after the floods, but the turf will be weakened once we get through the cooler months and then start to come into the next spring. That's when these diseases can come forward. So we need to be prepared for that and maybe initiate some disease control programs as well. So there's going to be some ongoing, so you can do the initial cleanup, the initial sort of small renovations to aerate the soil and to stimulate some fresh root growth. But probably for the next 6 months or so, the sports fields in particular are going to need regular spiking to maintain the infiltration rate, weed control, disease control that I've spoken about. Also, the turf managers need to have a look at the root systems and see what condition they're in so that they can start to think about their ongoing management strategies. Undertaking some soil tests as well, just to see what the nutrient levels are like, to see what other contaminants may necessarily be in the soil. Probably one of the things from a soil contamination point of view is if there's sort of hydrocarbons may have been in the flood waters, potentially they may have some impact on turf health and turf condition and also the soil functionality as well. But the important one too is to have a renovation lined up in the following early summer. And normally, most sports fields in particular will have major renovations each year. It may need to be a little more intensive, may need some more hollow coring, deep tine aeration, good top dressing program, again to restore the characteristics of that root zone and to make sure that we've got a good permeable profile with good drainage capabilities. And I just say there, look below the surface. So often we look at things just on the top and visually it might look okay, but we need to be understanding what's happening underneath as well.
That's right, John. Thank you. I think that's the end of your section. So thanks for that. I guess just I just want to run through a couple of ideas and potential ways you can minimise impact from the floods. We can't stop the floods. The floods occurring because they're in floodplain areas, but there's some things we can do around each sport that can help minimise the extent of those floods. So as Andrew sort of alluded to from an athletics track perspective, if it is built in an area that is potentially going to get inundated with flood waters, try to make it an impervious system. So have a system that doesn't allow water to readily penetrate through the profile and lead to the potential delamination. Try to utilise sports equipment that can be readily removed. We don't always get enough warnings to do it, but some throw cages are very large and expensive, and if we can find if you invest in the right system that allows it to be readily lowered prior to the flood impacting it, it can save some money afterwards. Invest in secure on-site storage facilities. A lot of athletics equipment is stored on-site in a storage shed or a shipping container. Make sure that that's as stable and as firm on the ground as possible. And I guess the question we should always ask ourselves, if it is in an area that it can be potentially inundated by floodwaters, do we need that element? Do we need a hammer throw cage and a discus throw cage at that event? Do we need a steeple water jump? Things that could easily be damaged and sometimes don't have a high level of usage. It will impact on the ability for that venue to host a certain level of competition, but consideration should be had at that stage. From a hard courts, in particular tennis and netball, where possible, try to avoid a cushioned surface. As Andrew said, if you get gouges in there, you can repair it, but as soon as you get a little bit of a tear in a cushioned surface, there's potential for water to then make its way through the layers, and then it's trapped in there and you will get bubbles at a later stage. So if your courts are in a floodplain area, look for a non-cushioned system, which probably bulk of courts are, but try to avoid the need for a cushioned surface if you can. The inclusion of an asphalt pavement minimises the expansion joints if it's concrete. So concrete will have expansion joints. If you can get silt and the like in those joints, that could potentially clog up those joints, and if they're not properly cleaned out. So a seamless asphalt surface can be has no joints that would be impacted, and if there is damage, they're readily repairable. If the time's there, again, similar to the athletics track, having a netting system that's readily removable. And where possible on the perimeter nets on a tennis court, try to minimise the extent of windbreaks, because as soon as they've got flood waters with debris in it, those windbreaks become impenetrable. From a short pile synthetic, so hockey and tennis, look at direct sticking it to the base of the shock pad. In the case of hockey, where you have a shock pad, sticking it to the shock pad will potentially minimise the ability for that shock pad to be used for a second resurface at the latter date, but you will still probably be able to salvage a fair portion of it. It just means that in a flood area, it doesn't readily get lifted. Look at an in situ shock pad rather than prefabricated. A prefabricated one, as in that photo that Andrew showed earlier with the long pile, it becomes more readily buoyant, whereas an in situ shock pad will be one continuous poured element or close to, which will help prevent it being lifted because of the large scale of it. Similarly to before, the asphalt pavement, if you've got a tennis court just on a crushed rock base, as Andrew mentioned, there's a potential for that crushed rock base to be washed away, that dust layer be washed underneath. So by always having an asphalt pavement underneath gives you a greater level of protection. Robust shelters. There's a lot of shelters out there. If you're again in a floodplain area, putting a robust shelter in there will help minimise the chances of it being washed away, particularly if it's fixed to the ground. And having a netting that can be readily removed from a tennis perspective. Long pile, there's not a lot we can do to protect it without trying to raise it above the floodplain levels. We've had some success with a free draining base pavement. So instead of having a solid compacted crushed rock base, using a free draining base, which might help mitigate some of the amount of volume of water at the surface, depending on the extent of the flood. There's some big projects in Sydney where they're actually elevating the pitches above floodplain areas and storing that or redirecting the flood waters underneath it and keeping it above there. Obviously, that comes at a significant cost. In the case of that image that Andrew showed earlier of that pitch that was badly moved around, that was filled with rubber infill. So as a result, there'll be a lot of rubber now that's been washed downstream. So looking at an organic infill or an infill-free system that doesn't have the rubber from an environmental perspective is obviously a benefit. An in situ pad, again, helps minimise the chance that it becomes readily buoyant. And one thing that we implement on a lot of our designs now is to have a concrete upstand if we're allowed to, if it doesn't impact on flood water. So in the case that it is a medium to low flow event, you're not losing all your infill and protecting it also from water coming in over the top. And a little simple detail, potentially fixing it to a timber edging around the perimeter. From an actual turf, having a high performing profile and supporting drainage. Now that won't get you through the floodplain. That won't affect the amount of flood that occurs on there, but what it will do is potentially help dry the profile out. So as John alluded to, saturated profiles are very difficult to work with. So having a high performing profile that allows the floodwaters to drain through the profile when everything's subsiding allows you to get it back on it quicker and undertake those maintenance works. As I alluded to previously, robust shelters. In the case of AFL goals and rugby goals in particular, having a hinged base goal system can allow you to readily lower the goals if you have enough timing. If not, if they snap at the base at the hinge as a result of floodwaters, you're not having to replace the whole footing system and just replacing the hinged connection. Hybrid turf can potentially help protect the turf in high wear areas and allow it to get back to health, and rather than the use of synthetic grass potentially. And if possible, elevating your irrigation infrastructure, your pumps and your water tanks so that they are protected from those high flow events. So, all right, well, thank you everyone for dialing in. I think hopefully you get a lot out of it. As I said, if you have any further queries, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll send through some contact details and a summary of this presentation that hopefully helps and assist you get back onto your fields of play. So thank you all for your time and good luck.